Welcome back from Japan, everybody. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at rounds number 7 and 8 of the Grenke Freestyle Chess Opening being held in Karlsruhe, Germany. Now, before we dive into this video, I want to take a moment and thank everybody who has watched these videos over the last couple of years. It is truly astounding to me that no matter where I go around the world, including Japan, there are so many people who recognize me and compliment me on the many videos. So I must say once again, thank you so much to everybody out there. And without you guys, none of this would be possible. So thank you once again. Now, back to the video before it starts sounding too much like an ad. We are covering the Grenke Chess Festival being held in Germany. Of course, it features Fischer Random Chess and the 5-time world champion Magnus Carlsen, fresh off his victory in the Paris Freestyle Grand Slam Chess Tour event, is trying to go for immortality in this open tournament. Now, thus far, he is 6 out of 6, and we're going to pick it up in round number 7. He is playing with the white pieces against the very strong Grandmaster Parham Magsudolu from Iran. Now, Parham doing very, very well in this event with 5.5 out of 6. It must be mentioned that whoever finishes in second place will get an automatic invite into the next Freestyle Chess Grand Slam event being held in Las Vegas in America, so there is a lot on the line. Alright, so round number 7, Magnus has the white pieces, and the game starts out with the move c3. Now, of course, another random setup, we get the move e5 here, and now Magnus plays move f4. Now, it's important to note that after this move c3, d5 is already considered, or e5 I should say, is already considered a slight mistake, because once white plays move f4, black cannot maintain a grip on the center. If you were to go e4, for example, white will simply capture the pawn, which means that here, white has already achieved a bit of an advantage. Now, what's amazing is we're on move number 2, and the computer already says this is 0.6, which also speaks to how strong Magnus is and how good his intuition is becoming in this variant. So we get the move f4. Parham decides to trade. We get the move knight to d3 from Magnus. Of course, Magnus could have played queen takes f4 as well, but the concept behind knight to 3 is very beautiful in that Magnus can now castle the king, and he can also capture the pawn on f4 with the horse. Now, if Magnus were to capture with the queen, there's nothing wrong with this, but down the road, for example, say we get some position like this, just to illustrate the point, black can very quickly play a move like c6 to open up the diagonal, putting pressure on the queen and the pawn. Now, the other reason this is a really nice touch from Magnus here is that it is not so obvious which way you want to castle, because again, as I just mentioned, you can move the bishop and go to the king side, but the computer loves this idea with knight to d3. Now we get to move c6, Magnus decides to castle, and here Parham plays the move d5. Now this move is a mistake here, but already at this point it's a very tricky spot for black. The computer says that after the very obvious, and by that I'm being extremely sarcastic, move knight to d6, black's apparently fine after queen takes f4 and castles here, but frankly, putting a knight in front of the pawn here, which is on d7, doesn't make a whole lot of sense here to a human. You feel like you're stopping the pawn from pushing, and it just looks very weird. But that being said, of course, it is a great move. So you get d5, the natural human move. You build the connect 3 in the center of the board, and you take a little bit of space with this pawn on d5. So we get the move knight to b3 from Magnus, and now Parham plays the move knight to d6. Now you're probably wondering, can't black play a move like g5 and simply guard the pawn at f4? While this move might look like it's possible, this is actually a move after which there is no coming back. White can play the very thematic move bishop to d4, attacking the rook, and after f6 and the move h4, black has all kinds of problems here keeping this pawn chain intact, and something is going to give. In fact, not even something is going to give. You're going to simply lose the game in the next couple of moves. So, we get the move knight to d6 being played, and now we have the move queen takes f4 being played by Magnus, and here we get the move queen to e7. Now, in this position, queen to e7 is a very logical move. Parham trying to potentially castle the king to the queen side or the king side here, but Magnus now jumps in with the bishop to c5, pinning the horse on d6. Parham plays the move knight to b6, and now Magnus plays the move knight to d4. Parham goes g6, logical move as white is threatening to potentially go knight to f5, and now we get the move knight to e5. Now what Magnus has done is he's completed his development, he's castled the king, and because Parham has these issues with these bishops, the king, and the rooks that are underdeveloped, Magnus is trying to jump with these knights and attack immediately. Now, while this is really, really good according to the computer, there is a slight danger here, which is that when you play for these ideas where you attack very, very early, if your opponent is ready for it and they can withstand the initial onslaught, you can end up in some trouble. So we get the move f6. Magnus, of course, sacks the horse, takes back on c6, we get queen c7, and now we get to move queen to e3. Now this is the first move which the computer is not a huge fan of. It would have preferred for Magnus to go for the very surprising move knight takes b8 here, because now after queen takes c5, white can go knight to a6, attacking the queen. Let's say the queen goes to a5, and now after queen takes f6, black can take the horse, white takes the rook, black castles the king. But after a move like queen to d4, white is much better here because the rook and a couple of pawns here. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. White has a rook and 3 extra pawns in return for the bishop and the knight, and white is simply winning. Now, this, of course, is very, very deep. It's very computerish. But the main point behind this line is that here black has a terrible bishop on g8, which is not in the game as it's walled off by the pawn. Instead, we get queen to e3. Parham goes king to d7. Worth pointing out that king to f7 would lose on the spot here to the very beautiful move rook d to f1, because after queen takes horse, white will sack the rook, with rook takes pawn, and after king takes rook, white can now play the move rook to f1, checking the king. If you go knight to f5, there's queen e7, checkmate, as the knight gets pinned here, and the king has no squares available. And if black goes king g7, there's bishop d4, and it's spaghetti-o time. The king has nowhere to run, and it gets checkmated again. So Parham goes king d7. Magnus takes the rook, Parham takes, we get the move h4, and now we have the move bishop to e6. Now, one of the important points is that you always look at the computer evaluation. For example, with this game, you're thinking, well, white must be much better. It's plus 1.3, white should be winning, but you have to be very careful because this is one of those positions where even though the computer says it's winning, black's plans and moves are a little bit easier here. Black simply wants to try to attack on the queen side here, use these knights, and white doesn't have an obvious concrete plan. So even though the computer says this is winning, honestly, in a game, I would almost prefer to be black here, because if white is not super precise, you run great risk of losing the game. So we get h5. g5 played by Parham. Magnus goes rook to f1, pressuring the pawn, and now we get the move knight d to c4. Magnus plays queen f2, and now we get the move knight to a4, and all of a sudden, here come these knights on the queen side, putting a lot of pressure on the pawn on b2, and Magnus is going to have to be extremely precise if he wants to preserve the advantage. Now, Magnus, of course, despite playing great chess, is only human, and he plays the move bishop f5. Now, this move is a terrible decision. Magnus takes a position where it's plus 1.5, and he turns it into an advantage for black if black can play the best moves. Now here Parham plays move bishop to f4. Worth pointing out that Parham has used a lot of time here. As you can tell from the clock, Parham has 10 minutes on the clock and Magnus has 30 minutes. So time probably will play a role, especially because of how complicated this position is. So in this position, what Parham should have played is the move knight takes bishop, and after queen takes knight, there's the very unusual move queen to b6, offering the trade of these queens, but also threatening to go for something like queen takes b2, which would be checkmate on the white king. Now here you're probably thinking, well, why can't white just take the pawn? If white takes the pawn, after king to e7, white will, not king e7, sorry, after king to c7, my mistake, the queen is suddenly en prise, and if you take the horse, I take your queen, and if you move the queen anywhere else, you once again run into this checkmate on b2, and therefore you would have to trade the queens, and now after takes, even though white has a rook and once again 2 pawns in return for the knight and the bishop, black is much better here as the rooks simply don't have any open files to use. So Parham goes bishop to f4, understandable move. He's trying to slam the door shut on this f file so that the queen and the rook have no threats. Magnus plays the move queen d4, and now we get the move king to c6. Now, Parham plays the move pretty quickly. Computer says after knight takes c5, black is actually substantially better, because after queen takes pawn, there's the move knight to d6 here, blocking the check on the queen. Your knight guards the bishop if white trades. Now you're left with a situation where you have 2 knights and a bishop in return for a rook. Last time I checked, according to Common Core math, 9 points is worth more than 5. Now, after queen takes c5, knight takes f5 and e3. Position is still very murky. Computer says black should go queen b6 here, offering the trade of the queens, and after takes and g4, due to the great bastion knight on f5, which can jump to g3, combined with ideas like bishop d5, pressuring this pawn on g2, black is much better. So, black would be much better if this were to occur, but again, this is very tough to find, and with only 6 minutes on the clock, frankly, it's borderline impossible in my opinion. Alright, so, back to the game. After queen d4, we get the move king to c6, and now Magnus takes the bishop, Parham takes, we get the sack, takes, takes, knight d6 takes, and queen takes a2. Now, a lot has happened in the last 5 moves. I went through those moves very quickly because they were simply moves that were played at tempo. They were pretty much forced, but we're left with this situation where black has a queen and 2 knights, and Magnus has a queen and a rook. Now, you'll notice the time has evened out quite a bit here. Magnus is down to 13 minutes. Parham still has 7 minutes, so it feels like Parham has turned it around, and as you can tell from the valuation bar, position is supposed to be equal. But one of the big dangers about playing against Magnus, and I speak from personal experience obviously when I say this, is that it's very easy to play against Magnus and at a certain point relax in the game. Now, this is a game where Parham has been under immense pressure from the get-go, from as early as I would say move 5, or maybe a little bit earlier, let's say move 9-ish or even earlier than that. Parham has been struggling. He's been having to burn all his time. He's been trying to find the best moves. He's been defending valiantly. But one of the things that happens is at a certain point, you start to feel like you can relax a little bit here. And I think at this point, Parham probably assumed that he was at least equal, if not better, in this position. But one of the problems against playing Magnus is that he still finds the best moves in the position. You might think it's fine, but you still have to be on your guard. So, after we get to move queen takes a2, Magnus plays move d4, and this is probably the big moment in the game because Parham spends 6 minutes before playing this move, knight to b3. Now, knight b3 is the best move in the position, but the reason that I talk about using the time usage in this situation is that one of the things that I did very poorly against Magnus in the recent freestyle event was in my first game against him. I had 4 minutes on the clock. I moved too quickly, made this horrible blunder when I played bishop to a2. But Parham does the exact opposite, where he plays a move, but he uses way too much time. So there's a very fine line between using too much time and not using enough time. And if Parham had played this move knight to b3 in, let's say, 3 or 4 minutes versus spending 6 minutes plus on this move, I think there's a very, very good chance that he would have gone on to draw the game. Now, knight b3 is the best move. We get king c2, queen to a4, and now Magnus plays move d5. Now, this is probably another moment where I think Parham relaxed. I cannot speak for Parham. Obviously, he was the one playing the game, but I suspect that somewhere around this moment, if we go back here, just to get back here, he probably thought no chance of losing, and I have a draw. And then Magnus plays d4, and you're still thinking, okay, queen to a4, all kinds of fossils and discoveries on the king should be no worse than a draw. There should be no risk, and if something happens, I should be the one winning. But Magnus, of course, still finds the best move when he plays d5, and now Parham plays move king c5 with 16 seconds left on the clock. Now, I think if Parham had realized the situation or had a bit more time, there's a very, very realistic chance that he would have gone king to d7, given up the pawn, and simply waited with the king on the back rank. But again, limited time here, you're trusting your instinct, and when you go king c5, you're thinking, well, wait, white's queen, it can't check the king. There's no check on c8, no check on d4 here. With no checks for the queen, surely there will be a fossil, and black will win the game. Unfortunately for Parham, or maybe you could say in a sense, luckily for Magnus, somehow everything works out, and he can simply grab this pawn on h7, and now black has no good fossils. You're probably thinking, well, why not check? But after knight to d4 check, now white can simply go king to d2, and when you check with knight c4, white can go king to e1, knight c2, king f2, and suddenly the juice is loose, the king is running to the king side, white's queen is going to checkmate this black king very quickly, and out of nowhere, there's no attack, there's no mate, nothing's going on, and especially when you have limited time, it's very jarring, because you see this position, you see D's knights, you see the discoveries, it feels like there should be something, and then it's like, uh-oh, spaghetti-o, there's nothing there, you're kind of getting low on time, you panic, and bad things always happen. So Parham finds the best move here, king to b6. We get to move queen g6, and now, rather shockingly, Parham Magsudaloo runs out of time. He flags in this position. He had 43 seconds on this move. He lets his time run out before he plays the move king to, I believe it was c7, and he ends up losing the game. This position is still probably playable in a human game after king c7 because the line the computer gives with h6, black can go knight to d4 check, double checking the king. If you go king to d2, there's a beautiful line with knight to e4. Here come D's knights in the middle of the board. If white takes the knight, you have knight b3, checking the king, attacking the queen on e4. King d3, knight c5 will win the game. And if white moves the king to, I don't know, c2, queen e4, king b3, apparently here black is only slightly better after queen g6. It's not actually even winning, but nonetheless, you won't lose the game. But white can play the move king to c1, and after queen to a1, queen b1, knight b3, king c2, queen to a4. White is probably winning this position after the very surprise move rook to d3. Again, all kinds of fossils, but with his passed h-pawn running up the board, white should be winning according to the computer. Now, were you to play the move h7, which is the more likely human move here, black has a great move, knight to c4, and here come these knights right next to white queen, or white king, I should say. If white were to queen the pawn, for example, there's knight to e3, king d3, and there's queen c4, which is checkmate because these knights cover all the critical squares, and the king cannot escape. So, this would have been really exciting to see the finish had Parham not flagged. I still think there's a very good chance Magnus would have won, because I think this whole concept with going for knight d4 and knight d4, queen a1, knight b3, knight c4 is very, very hard to find, but still, it would have been great to see it. For Magnus, he probably was breathing a sigh of relief after this game ended, because this is one of the few times where Magnus had a sense that he was in danger in this tournament. He was potentially much worse for one or two moves, but nonetheless, he showed great resilience, kept finding the best move. It is one of the things that does set Magnus apart from a lot of the other players, is that even when he knows he's messed up, he still has this ability to find the best move in spite of knowing that he's messed up or he spilled the paint on the canvas. So, Magnus gets the win, moves to 7 out of 7, and now we're going to move to the 8th round, where Magnus tries to remain perfect and is playing with the black pieces against Rauf Mamedov from Azerbaijan. Now, one short station break before we get into this game, because thought popped into my head, is that I do pay attention to some of the comments on the videos, and one of the comments on the videos was something like, how can you cover these Magnus games without being super jealous or unhappy with his results? Now, the answer is quite simple, which is in these times, I make a lot of content. I love covering these games, and so the actual results, whether it's Magnus's games, my games, or things of that nature, don't matter so much, but I will be honest and keep it straight, where in the old days, when the only thing I had was simply playing chess and sort of, I would say, ranking my value or valuing myself based on how well or how poorly I did, these sorts of things would definitely upset me, but these days, the results matter a lot less because I do have a lot of other things going on. So I just wanted to say that because I saw that comment. I was going to mention at the top of the video, but I kind of forgot, so I thought I would mention here because better late than never. All right, so round number 8, Magnus has the black piece against Rauf Mamedov, and the game starts with a move e4. Magnus plays c5, essaying the classic Siciliano defense from the black side. This move is a big mistake, but already at this point, Magnus knows he's going to win the tournament, and he might as well try to play for imbalances. Now, he could play a move like e5 here, but after knight to f3, let's say knight to f6, for example, white can play d4 here, or even c3 and d4, and the position is very, very symmetrical. White probably won't have a lot of issues in the opening, also because both sides here can castle to the king side immediately. So we get a Siciliano from Magnus. Rauf plays knight f3. We get the move d5. And now we have the move pawn takes pawn. Now, already on move number 3, we get a big inaccuracy from Mamedov here. In this position, computer says after e5, d4, and then I guess the move queen e2. White is supposed to be better. Honestly, I don't know if I agree with that assessment because the bishop on b1 looks very, very passive here behind the pawn walls. Black can play bishop g4, and these bishops look incredibly strong for black. Actually, now that I look, evaluation has changed. Computer doesn't completely agree. So we get e takes d5. Magnus plays knight to b6, activating the knight from the rim and immediately trying to bring it to the center of the board. Rauf plays d4, and now Magnus plays move queen b5, checking the white king on f1. We get queen to e2, takes, and now the great move pawn to c4, slamming the door shut on the center of the board. We're in an endgame here. Magnus is getting a knife on d5, and this is already a dream position because there is a situation where there will be no risk for Magnus and every opportunity to win the game. So we get c3, knight to f6, knight c2, bishop f5, knight a3, takes, and now we get the move knight f takes d5. Now, black isn't winning or anything in this position, but the pawn structure is advantageous here. You have this bastion on d5. White would love to put a pawn on e4 to kick the horse, but you can't do that. The pawn on c4 stops white from ever pushing. So, barring a pawn getting to c4 or e4, you have this great knight on d5, and black should be completely fine. In fact, just better, I should say. So, we get g3. Magnus plays f6, we get knight d2, rook c8, knight e4, and now we get the move bishop d6. Now, rook c8 is a very deep, nuanced move here from Magnus because the one thing that could happen if he's not careful is, let's just say black were to not play king g8, were to castle here. If white can play b3 and challenge the black center here, after takes, followed by c4, white should be okay. So when Magnus plays rook c8, this prevents white from playing b3, because after takes, now you will lose the pawn on c3 here, and with one less pawn on the board, you are going to lose. So we get knight e4. Magnus plays bishop d6, we get king d2, and now we have the move f5. Mammadov trades, goes rook e1, and now we get to move king f7. Now, for Magnus, he's got D's knights on b6 and d5, very, very well placed. White has a bad bishop on c1. It has emptied squares on all these diagonals. Not a whole lot is happening, and even though a computer would draw this easily from the white side, in a human game, I think that whoever's playing with black, assuming it's a strong grandmaster, is very likely to win against an equal opponent. So we get king c2. Magnus plays knight d7, knight d2, and now we get to move b5, reinforcing the pawn on c4. Now, Magnus's knight on d7 is much better than on b6 because here you guard the pawns, but the knight on d7 can start to reroute towards the king side in this position. We get g4 here, Magnus plays knight f6, we get takes, and now we get the very nice move, knight to e7, and suddenly Magnus is getting D's knights on f6, f6, and f5 here, and also white is in a situation with what we call the classic split pawns, similar to bowling. You get the pins that are split, and it's very hard to convert the spare. So, in this position here, if Magnus were to take the pawn on g4, for example, white would go knight to e4, and now suddenly this bastion on e4 is perfectly placed. You touch the pawn on d6, and after rook c6 and a move like h3, takes, white is putting pressure on the pawn. There's knight g5 check. Black's position is very tough to defend. Black is not losing, but black is also not better. So we get knight f6 takes knight e7, Mammadov plays knight f3, knight f5, we get knight g5, king g8, and now we get to move knight e4. Magnus trades the horses, goes king to f7, and at this point, we're headed towards an endgame where Magnus is on pace for a miniature. Now, the reason I mention that is black has a bash on f5. This knight cannot be removed. If you could put this pawn on g4, you could attack the knight. If you could put a pawn on e4, for example, you could attack the knight as well. But with no pawn to remove the knight and the fact that black is going to put all his pawns on the opposite color of the Starks or bishop, everything is looking up for Magnus here. So we got rook h1. We have rook h8, f3 played by Mammadov, and now we get to move h6. Of course, Magnus does not trade the rooks on e4 because then white builds a big white center, you lose your bastion, and now white is completely fine. So we get to move h6. Mammadov goes bishop f4, Magnus plays d5, we get to move rook to e5, and here we get takes, and knight e7. Now, this underscores the positional genius of Magnus when he plays h6, because if he were to go d5 right away, after rook e5, takes, knight e7, white could go bishop g5, undermining the horse, and now black is going to lose some material. Whereas in the game, when we get this position after knight e7, the knight guards the pawn, but now the pawn on h6 stops bishop g5, and already here, this is technically close to a loss for white. We get rook e2, Magnus goes rook c6, bishop e5, knight f5 back, king d2, and now we get to move rook a6, a3, and rook to g6. Now, Magnus here is close to winning primarily because this bishop on e5 has no good targets. The pawn on g7 is guarded, the knight on f5 is a bashing, you can infiltrate with the rook, you have knight h4 as well, so this bishop is simply dead on e5. We get king e1, rook g1, king f2, rook b1, bishop c7, and now we get to move a6 from Magnus. Now, all of these pawns are on the light squares here, so this bishop is useless, and now it's a matter of simply converting for Magnus. We get bishop d8, king g6, king g2, king h5, bishop c7, and now we get to move knight h4, king f2, and g5. Now, even though black has pawns on dark squares on the king side here, white still cannot not attack them because its rook is permanently tied down to the pawn on b2, and the bishop can't attack anything as well. So now it's a matter of Magnus rerouting the knight, the king, and the rook to create the breakthrough. We get to move bishop g3, and now Magnus plays the move knight to g6. We get king g2, rook d1, king h3, rook d3, king g2, and now Magnus makes a very, very tiny, imprecise inaccuracy with a5 here. Knight to h4 is apparently winning, but without knowing that it's winning here, playing for this idea of b4 on the pawn break is completely logical as well. We get king f2. Magnus goes b4. Here we get to move pawn takes pawn. Now, the computer will argue that after rook to e3, black isn't completely winning in this position, but this move rook to e3 is very odd, because after rook to d2, rook e2, takes, and a4 here, bishop cannot attack any of these pawns on the light squares, and it feels very much like once black puts his knight on f5 here, black probably will get some g4 breakthrough and win the game, but the computer does say that this is still probably a draw with perfect play. But Ralph trades on b4, and now he takes on b4 after a long think. You'll also notice one thing I haven't mentioned in regards to this game is the time situation, where once again Magnus is putting massive pressure on the clock on his opponent, and it's just too much to deal with. Now, after rook to e3, this endgame is a little bit different because after check, takes, and b3, black's pawns on the light squares are very close to the end of the board. This might still be a draw after h3, knight e7, not king f2, sorry, something like bishop e1, knight f5, and king f2, and maybe somehow white can save this game, but honestly, this looks very miserable, primarily because if you're not careful, and you get some position, just to illustrate the point, like this, for example, black can sack the knight, and after takes, there's c3, and one of these pawns is going to crash through and become a queen. So Ralph takes on b4. Magnus plays rook to b3 here, attacking the pawn. We get bishop d6, and now we have the move knight h4. Now Magnus is just playing every best move here. The rook targets the pawns, the knight targets f3, and everything is simply collapsing for Mamedov. We get bishop c5, rook f3, king e1, rook b3 back. Now the pawn can't advance. We get king d1, knight to f3, and now Magnus has the free hand on the king side to start pushing his p and finishing off the game. We get king c1, g4, bishop d6, king h4, rook e8. Now we get h5, rook h8, and the move king g5. Now, unless Mamedov were able to push his b pawn through and start to create some counterplay, there's just nothing you can do. d4 is always hanging. You have to deal with the two pawns rushing up the king side, and it's just totally hopeless. And of course, you also don't have any time here, which makes matters even worse. We get rook to d8, Magnus goes king f5, we get rook e8, and here Magnus plays the move h4. We get rook to e2, and now we have the move rook to d3. Magnus correctly understands that this b pawn cannot rush up the b file here, so black has plenty of time to capture the pawn on d4. We get the move king b1. Knight takes d4 is played by Magnus, and now we get the move rook to e5, and after the move king to f6, Mamedov resigns this game because here black is already up one pawn, but if you take on d5, there's king to e6, and you will lose either the rook or the bishop in this position. And if you play a move like rook to e1, for example, there are many ways for black to win. Simplest is to go knight f3, let's say you go rook to e8, and black will go back to b3, and after, say, king c1, now black has a free hand to start pushing the d pawn. With all the wide peepos rushing up the board, there's just not a whole lot that you can do. So, another positional masterpiece for Magnus in round number 8. He now moves to a massive score of 8 out of 8 with a performance rating of infinity. He is going to be playing round number 9 in a couple of hours. I think in the final round, he's likely going to play either Fabiano Caruana or Vincent Keimer, so he's probably going to have to play one of the absolute top dogs in the final round of the event. But at any rate, it's been a massive pleasure to watch Magnus just blow through this field, show great class throughout. And also, of course, he is going to win this tournament even if something crazy happens in round 9. But no doubt he will go all in against Vincent Fabio or whomever he plays. And we'll see if Magnus Carlsen can achieve immortality with end perfection with a score out of 9, with a score of 9 out of 9 in the Grenke Freestyle Open chess tournament. So, on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from Japan once again. I will definitely do a recap of round number 9, potentially a Magnus game pair with another one. But I hope you guys have enjoyed it, and if you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with some more great recaps in the near future. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and see you very soon. Bye!